politics is complicated. Yes. And so that's sort of one of the challenges that we tend to come into when we start talking about democracy promotion and governance. And so when we're talking about governance, should we be talking about programs to teach taxation structures, or should we be talking about legislatures and working with parliamentary actors who are going to be outside accountability mechanisms to an internal democracy?
Well, I think that will be an interesting one for all three of us, we three entities, to talk about, because we all do that type of work. I think AID, I don't want to speak, oh, there's Ro. Hi, Ro. I didn't want to speak too much for them, but I know that's something that they have to be very, very careful about because of, you know, they're being the development agency. But anyway.
What was the question? Sorry.
I just talking about, oh, sorry, Patricia, please.
No, Monika, it's your question.
It's the one of the key challenges, which we did touch base on Monday, is where the Canadian bureaucracy has kind of an aversion and a hesitance about the political nature of the work of democracy promotion. They are happy to do a lot of the policy work, but reluctant to work with political actors because they see that as kind of interference, and they don't want to be caught working with the wrong political actor. So this sort of taps into the question number 4 that's on the list about the sensitivities around working with the individuals that are going to be part of, that are needed to be successful in the process, working with political parties, working with actors and like women candidates even. So how you as a government bureaucracy actually navigates that question. And this also touches on the nature of arm's length versus internal actions, like what is
absolutely
doing and USAID doing, and how are you determining funding while supporting, I mean, obviously your initiatives, and you want your partners' initiatives to be in line with Canadian foreign policy, or with American foreign policy, sorry for you guys. For Canada. we have our own, or we like to think we have our own.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I'm prepared to talk about that. What I would say is this is the hot debate happening right now. You know, is development work, you know, political? You know, it's not, you know, this is the core of the conversation. If democracy is political, or if development's political. So I think what you're seeing is, you know, a live debate that maybe the ways we've been thinking about it aren't really that realistic or accurate. And that, you know, you're seeing a shift in you know, the importance, not just the importance of DRG work, but how we do DRG work. So I don't think we're going to get a clear answer on this in this discussion, because, you know, this is being debated everywhere right now.
Do you find it's more now so than before? As a Canadian that worked for NDI for years, I was always really fascinated how there was a consensus. And even though I saw different consensuses breaking in the States, even in the last administration, democracy support kind of survived untouched, at least from what I could see. That it didn't get thrown out. You know, you had Mark Green that was there. And so I think, to me, it survived.
Oh, I was actually thinking about it more going the other way.
Okay.
That, you know, and that's definitely what I'll talk about, how DRG is core to development work. And then we have to continue to move away from thinking of just technical solutions.
Yeah. Okay, I got you.
So yeah, no, I'm saying we're going to keep going in the direction of DRG is foundational. Good. To security, development,
yes.
The whole.
I thought you meant that political national. Okay. No. Gotcha. And I'm in agreement with you.
I think, I hate to cut this off, but I think everyone is now here. And I guess we're going to go live in a little under a minute. So just.
Okay. And how do I can't see everyone. Let me just.
No, we're going to, yeah. And Nick, I see it's not showing attendees in the space yet. Are they in a waiting room?
They're in a waiting room. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Where do I do I can't see everyone on different layouts. One second. Participants.
Should be top right hand view.
Okay.
But when we go
information about even a year and a half later, we're all still struggling with technology.
I know, it's crazy.
But we will change it. Or Nick will change it from the administrative side so that we'll just be the speaker feature during the talk. All right.
All right, here we go. In 3, 2, 1. And I'm going to disappear.
Good afternoon, good evening, if you happen to be somewhere where it's evening. I'd like to thank the U.S. Embassy again for funding this dialogue series, and to Gabrielle Bardell for her important role in organizing this. The Parliamentary Center is based in Ottawa, which is on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe, who have been the traditional stewards of this land for generations. This is the end of Aboriginal Heritage Month, and it's important for us as we celebrate Canada Day tomorrow as well, to reflect on the 94 recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as well as the calls for justice from the National Inquiry into the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Specifically, the recommendations related to reconciliation, the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, under the calls to action, because they're intrinsically part of our mission for human rights and democracy. The Parliamentary Center was founded in 1968, as you may know, as an advisory body and support to our Foreign Affairs Committee. And at that time, our Parliament didn't have, it thought, the resources it needed to grapple with the challenges it was experiencing. And it's interesting that over the years, starting in the 90s, as our Parliament strengthened its internal capacities, we set our sights elsewhere to try to share the experiences of stronger legislatures with others. And so we are reminded that parliaments and democracies are always in need of growing and strengthening. This type of work, I think, is really important in terms of strengthening democratic institutions, which is why we are brought here today. We have invited a number of people who have worked in and on democracy strengthening for years. They've devoted their professional careers to doing that. And it's something we want to rely on as Canada makes some important decisions. We've had an interesting journey towards how Canada will present itself on the international stage in terms of democracy strengthening. In June 2019, there was a very strong and unanimous report from the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee with 15 recommendations to say it's time for Canada to really get serious about democracy support. We're, as the Parliamentary Center, a full partner in that pursuit, and trying to facilitate dialogues to help decision makers make informed decisions about what Canada's presence in that front should be, and how we can best make use of not only our own experiences as a democracy, but also the relationships we have in the developing world. I do want to introduce our two moderators for today. Very excited to have Tom Axworthy with us, a Munk Senior Fellow, and he's had invaluable contributions for many years in the pursuit of helping Canada decide what it wants in terms of its presence in the democratic development space. And we're very, very thankful for his presence with us today. Also, Monika LeRoy, who is now working as an advisor to the Secretary General of the OAS, but with extensive experience in democracy strengthening. I had the privilege of working with Monika at Rights and Democracy in a past life, and really happy she's with us today. So I would turn it over to our moderators to get us going. I'm, again, very appreciative for the participation of senior folks from State Department, from USAID, and from NED that have joined us today. We really appreciate your thoughts and your contributions, and we look forward to a great dialogue. So thank you so much. Over to you, Tom and Monika.
Good. Well, thank you, Tom, and hello to our audience. We're very much looking forward to a dialogue with our American colleagues on mutual learning. As Tom has just said, this is a very important moment for those of us who support and enhance democratic institutions and viability in Canada, because we have a long tradition in Canada of supporting the ideals of democracy and indeed democracy support. We can go back, our American colleagues may reference President Carter and his influence in human rights, and President Reagan's famous speech to Westminster about democracy support. In Canada in 1948 and 49, Lester Pearson put into the NATO treaty, Article 2, that the members of NATO should strengthen their free institutions and promote democracy. Now that wasn't observed very robustly as NATO has developed, but it shows Mr. Pearson's heart was in the right place. And so democratic attainment has been part of the Canadian tradition. And we have had Parliamentary Center is one, a series of institutions, Elections Canada, Forum for the Federations. Many Canadian institutions have worked on differing pieces of the democratic puzzle. And individually, Canadians from all parties on any democratic assistance mission I have been on, there have been many Canadians from all parties working on different parts. And so other institutions of democracy in the Nordic countries, the United States and elsewhere, have found Canadians to be willing and good contributors to working with others because we have the mixture of federalism and multiculturalism, the charter, and our own democratic traditions. So Canada potentially has a lot to offer in this democratic space. But it's also fair to say, and hence our tremendous interest in this dialogue, that perhaps a democratic strategy or institutions within government to give effect to that strategy is probably less developed than our colleagues and our partners in the Nordic world, in the UK with the Westminster Foundation, and indeed we'll be hearing from our American colleagues today. So should Canada up its game in democracy support, and if so, how? And we're anxious to learn from our American colleagues on how that could perhaps happen. And now I'm happy to turn it over to Monika LeRoy, my co-moderator, who will introduce our American guests. And as Thomas said, she herself, Monika, has had a long tradition of not only thinking about the strategy, but working in the trenches on democratic assistance. Monika.
Thank you, Tom. Tom Cormier, Gabrielle, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for putting today's conversation together for us. I'm excited that we always seem to find new opportunities to work together. Tom Axworthy, it's an absolute honor to be able to share a platform with you, and I'm excited how much we've had the chance to work together over the past year. This is an exciting moment for Canada to be reinvigorating the conversation about what our role is in the world in democracy assistance and how we want to talk about our values of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law at home and abroad. We're very honored to have very senior representation from the US government today and partners. We have with us from the State Department, Patricia Davis, who is the Director of the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor Office of Global Programs, where she oversees the development and funding of DRL's human rights, democracy, and labor programs. Patricia has held various positions within the State Department, USAID, and on the US National Security Council addressing these issues. We also have with us Rosarie Tucci, who's the Director of the Center for Democracy and Human Rights and Governance at USAID. She has extensive experience both inside and outside of government working on human rights issues and supporting programs with marginalized and excluded populations. And finally, I would like to introduce Brian Joseph, who is the Vice President for Programs at the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a congressionally funded nonprofit grant-making organization. And Brian brings to the panel today more than 20 years experience working to advance democracy and human rights around the world with special expertise in Asia and promoting democracy in closed societies. So with that, I would like to pass the floor over to Tom Axworthy, with that, I would like to pass the floor over to our panelists to make some introductory remarks.
Sorry, who would you like to go first?
Patricia, would you like to start?
Yes, okay. I'm hearing an echo. Is it better? Okay, all right, thank you. I apologize because we're not able to sync up audio and camera through State Department system. So if it looks a little weird, that's why. I want to
We've lost your audio, Patricia, I'm sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, I don't know what happened there. Sorry, I wanted to thank you all for inviting this. I was saying beforehand that I think this is the first time that NED and AID Drg Center, we've gotten together just to talk structurally about how we approach things. We collaborate very closely on the programming level, but this I think is going to be a fun opportunity to just each talk about how we approach democracy assistance with our own value adds. Let me just start with a few remarks and an overview of our history and how we do things. So as Tom noted, it was President Carter who made a firm way later than the Canadians, as I heard today, created in 1977, created the Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs to ensure that democratic values and human rights were enshrined in US foreign policy. We're now known as the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor, or DRL, if you hear that acronym. And our mandate is to target diplomatic engagement and foreign assistance programs directly at US foreign policy objectives, including the objective to promote fundamental freedoms. Over time, promotion of democracy and human rights has become central to the United States national security agenda, as was once again codified in the Biden administration's interim national security strategic guidance that was released in early March of this year. Since 1999, a little over 20 years now, DRL has been the lead agency at the State Department to operationalize those national security goals through our foreign assistance programs. In our first year in 1999, DRL started out with a foreign assistance budget of $7 million. This fiscal year, 2021, by the end of this fiscal year, we will have obligated nearly $400 million, which is a huge, substantial increase in a little more than 20 years. So we've gone from $7 million a year to $400 million a year. In the past 5 years alone, our appropriated foreign assistance and programming levels have more than tripled. So this increase has come, dramatic increases, particularly come in just these last 5 years. And I have to note here that over the years, DRL has benefited enormously from very, very strong bipartisan support on the Hill, from congressional support from both Republicans and Democrats, who recognize that foreign assistance tied to diplomatic engagement is critical to addressing threats to human rights on a global scale. Currently, we have more than 750 active programs that operate around the world. Over 90% of our programs take place in closed or closing societies where governments are undemocratic, commit egregious human rights violations and abuses, or countries where democracy and human rights advocates are under pressure, or in contexts where governments are either fragile or still transitioning to a more rights-respecting democratic society. Leveraging US foreign policy, DRL's programmatic tools are designed to protect and promote human rights, build sustainable democratic institutions, empower local civil society, and partner with democratic allies such as Canada to strengthen international rules and norms. DRL champions the inclusion and equality of all people by leading the State Department efforts to advance the rights of LGBTQI+ persons, persons with disabilities, and Indigenous persons. And this year, under the Biden administration, not only will we be expanding our gender equality programs, but we are launching new initiatives to promote racial equity. I want to talk then a little bit about the unique value add of DRL as from the three groups here. I would argue that DRL's strength is that we design our programs to fit immediate needs and to address real-time opportunity and challenges in the field of democracy and human rights. All of our programs are centrally managed out of here in Washington, DC. And unlike development agencies, DRL is sitting in a policy agency, and we design our programs to further specific human rights policy goals that are tied very closely to the State Department's flagship annual human rights reports. So what I'm saying is we're doing the reports, we have our finger on the pulse about what the issues are, and we can then very closely target our programming to address those issues and concerns. When DRL requests our budget, we do not request funding by country, saying we want X amount for this country and X amount for that country, but rather we submit a global request. So we just request one sum of funding. That then provides us the flexibility when we come in and allocate those fundings onto current events on the ground. Of course, I would note that it's also important that we be able to closely monitor these programs, especially since we are sitting in Washington, D.C. And I will say that the Bureau is committed to designing and managing foreign assistance that is evidence-based to ensure both impact of our programs and due diligence of American taxpayer funding. DRL is leading the State Department in our monitoring and evaluation strategies by putting a particular focus on program outcomes than rather just outputs. Our monitoring evaluation team, which has tripled in size in the past year, has enabled us to be more forward-looking, better design our programs and better measure impact and applied learning. For example, we have created custom indicators to measure democratic trajectories. So instead of just using the standard indicators for whether you've supported civil society or not, is what is civil society actually doing with that money? We also have pioneered a method where we work with our grantees themselves to determine what they think significant change would look like with this funding. So we start at the very beginning working with them to say, here's what the outcomes are that we expect, but what do you expect? And how can we then measure that change appropriately? And I think empowering our grantees, particularly these local civil society groups, has been eye-opening because it makes them have buy-in and saying, yes, we want this program to succeed because we're sharing, we have a shared approach to what we're trying to do. As a result, I would argue DRL has been able to demonstrate that we have made democratic change happen on the ground, and we can point to specific outcomes, such as whether rule of law and due process have been achieved in a country, or whether respect for fundamental freedoms has improved, or whether citizens have increased access to objective information and are less vulnerable to manipulation and misinformation. I'm just going to go into one small example here. For example, recently my monitoring evaluation team co-designed an internet freedom framework that aligns DRL's objectives for internet freedom, as well as the United States cybersecurity strategy, as well as the relevant consolidated appropriation acts, i.e. congressional earmarks. We've taken that and we designed this framework that informs the 4 pillars of our internet freedom programs, which are technology development, digital security, research, and policy advocacy. And we've now designed, here's how we will strategically allocate funding, but we also have now developed an evaluation plan that tests these theories of change upon which this framework rests. And it's based on gathering empirical data on the efficacy of both current and past internet freedom programmings to ensure that we're meeting both Bureau, State Department, and US national level objectives and learn from them in future designs. In addition to this example of how we better design and evaluate our programs, I also want to note that a few years ago, DRL developed a platform to provide third-party monitoring to our grantees in the field on the ground to ensure financial compliance. This is particularly because we pride ourselves in providing support to nascent groups on the ground, groups that are new or working in difficult environments. When we provide them with funds, we want to make sure that they are able to comply with the quite onerous, sometimes federal procurement regulations, but are assuring us that they are in compliance with those. In 2018, DRL went through a routine inspection from the Office of the Inspector General to conduct an audit of DRL's program management, and they signaled this platform out as a best practice for other US government entities to replicate. So you see that our goal to the US taxpayer is that we provide accountability, both financially and in terms of the outcome of our programs. Lastly, I would like to note that the US can't push back against threats to open societies alone, of course. So I want to note that DRL is very grateful to partner with like-minded allies like Canada to revitalize democracy in closing spaces. One such partnership is the Lifeline Embattled CSOs Assistance Fund, of which Canada is a founding member. Since 2011, the Lifeline Fund has provided emergency financial assistance and rapid response advocacy and resilience grants to over 2,700 CSOs around the world who have been threatened or attacked because of their work in human rights and democracy. And we know that this assistance works. We track this very carefully, and we know from the recipients that over 90% of them have reported back. They've been able to mitigate the threats they face and continue to do their valuable work. DRL has also partnered with Canada and other governments to support the Global Equality Fund, which is a unique and effective public-private partner that provides emergent assistance to LGBTQI+ organizations and persons who are under threat simply because of their sexual orientation and gender identity. This fund, beyond the emergency assistance, this fund also awards human rights technical assistance programs for grassroots LGBTQI+ organizations to catalyze positive change in more than 100 countries around the world. Lastly, DRL is very grateful for the continuing support that Canada has provided as a partner in the International Religious Freedom Fund, as well as its support for its precursor, before it was called the Religious Freedom Fund, to assist those who are facing violence and egregious persecution simply on the basis of their religion or beliefs. This partnership has also enabled us together to provide assistance to thousands of individuals over the past decade. So with that, I hope I've just given you a flavor of what our approach is, how we do our work, and particularly the importance of partnering with other governments such as Canada. So I wholeheartedly support the idea of Canada stepping up, upping its game. From our perspective, you've always been right there, but more of it, welcome it, and we're happy to work with you on that. So with that, I will stop, and I'm happy to answer any questions later.
Thank you very much, Patricia. If we can now pass the floor over to Rosarie Tucci for her introductory statement.
Great, thank you. So Pat talked a little bit about the introduction. You know, we call it democracy, rights, and governance work. It's just how we frame it. That's what our center is called. She talked about it as core to the national security interests. Not only does this assistance aim to uphold our values and beliefs and democratic principles and practices, but there's recognition that democracies are more likely to produce peace, stability, and prosperity. So that's been there for a while. I think, you know, what's new on the scene and really critical to the work at USAID is the SDG, Sustainable Development Goal number 16. And that puts USAID's DRG work, it makes it more universally recognized as a prosperous, inclusive, sustainable development and peace. And so I raised that point because I want to highlight one key aspect of USAID's DRG work. Most recently, our intentional efforts over the past 5 to 7 years, if you want to say, to advance inclusion of DRG principles and practices into programs across all development sectors. And unfortunately now, as Pat raised, closing spaces and conflict settings. You know, our programming, unfortunately, in those is growing well over than what it originally was at 65% programming. So we've made strong progress utilizing tools like the political economy analysis and working side by side with our climate, food security, education, and health experts to improve system strengthening, for example. And I'd love to come back to this idea of how improving or strengthening the systems of democracy. Because I think, you know, this integration into development work and thinking about the systems of democracy, I think that's really going to help illustrate it with what I see the challenge. I think a lot of people see the challenges right now of democracy delivering for its people. Now, what does that mean? Democracy delivering for its people in these critical development spaces. And so just a quick overview of the DRG Center. Our center is supporting our 80+ field missions who program the 1.6 billion of DRG activities. Much of it is in Europe, Eurasia, Middle East, Asia, Latin America is not far behind, and Africa is lagging at the end, which is something we could talk about more later. So in our model, the DRG programs in these countries are part of the larger country development strategies. So we're looking at employing long-term programming that helps to provide the foundational building blocks of democracy. And so the majority of the funding supports good governance and civil society, but also with strong support to protecting human rights, media strengthening, and political competition. This program is developed in coordination with our partner countries and builds on deep, long-standing networks and country connections. So just to give a couple highlights of the functions of the DRG Center, and then I could wrap it up. I would just highlight that the DRG Center is working to ensure that programming is applying proven practices and drawing on the latest scholarly and technical knowledge. And I'll talk a little bit about how we do that within the functions of our work. So first, we develop technical guides, publications, and policies to inform the DRG programming. So for example, most recently, we completed the political party assistance and rule of law policies, kind of looking at rule of law 2.0, if you want to call it that, and the next generation of rule of law programming. We develop and support the use of 7 assessment tools. It can be narrowly focused on civil society or media environment in countries, or more broadly, for example, our newest assessment is on helping to develop programming to navigate the tactics and strategies employed by authoritarians, building democratic resilience in the face of democratic backsliding. We also provide dozens of technical trainings on issues ranging from working in closed spaces to human rights programming. It's just a core to the functions that we provide. We also provide technical assistance on program design and rigorous monitoring and evaluation. And I'll talk a little bit more about our evidence and learning team in just a moment. Before I do that, we also offer a suite of pre-competed mechanisms, rapid response capabilities, and additional funding to enhance country programs and to navigate through unexpected moments of need based on changing country dynamics. And these funds are managed directly by the DRG Center. So I mentioned our learning and evidence team. It's about 7+ years old, but it's really helped the center's ability to generate and aggregate studies and evaluations and to disseminate knowledge products that are user-friendly and bite-sized for our colleagues in the field. I would also highlight our learning agenda in particular, which has asked nearly 40 difficult DRG questions and commissioned accompanying reports to dig deeper into how we can improve our programming in areas that are really thorny and difficult to figure out. So for example, just to give you two questions that we've asked of the 40, how well does pressure from civil society organizations, media outlets, and citizen participation improve accountability and transparency compared to internal reforms within judicial and political institutions? So kind of these two forms of accountability are often pitted against each other. And so we're working to dig deeper into, what are the outcomes of each? Another question that we've been more recently exploring is what are the effects of various kinds of external DRG support on the success of social movements? Under what conditions is such support successful? So it gives you a flavor of the types of questions we're asking within the learning agenda. So I'm going to wrap it up there. I think there's a lot of questions to unpack related to integration and how do we bolster that within development to ensure that democracy is delivering for its people, demand-driven, responding to demand-driven needs, assist thinking, how creating the systems of democracy, not importing US democracy, but thinking about the systems of democracy. And then also we could talk more about the virtuous learning cycle and how we link all these pieces of research, policy, practice, how we link those pieces together to come up with a more wholesome approach to democracy support. So I'll leave it there and look forward to questions.
Thank you. And Brian, if I could ask for your introductory statement as well.
Thanks, Monika. Thanks, Pat and Ro. Let me start by sort of describing the endowment, because I think it's a different institution that fits in and overlaps in many ways with both DRL and the Drg Center at AID, but it's a unique institution and really looks and feels and acts like an American institution. And the one thing I would tell you as you're beginning to dig into this more seriously about building the institutions is the ones that work reflect the political institutions, the political life of your own country. So the endowment was set up in the early to mid 1980s as basically a private expression of public ideals. So the idea is all governments, including the US government, have foreign policy objectives and broader long-term objectives that are often not one and the same. And so the idea was to set up an institution that was funded by the taxpayer, that brought together the four American sectors of organized life. So the two major political parties, labor and business, to promote democracy across political party systems, across administrations, and across time. So the private nature of it and its independent structural foundations give it that sort of durability. And it allows us to pursue our mission, which is singular. So all we do is democracy support. We don't have any other competing interests. We are not part of the US government, but we are absolutely a reflection of broad American ideals. And understanding that difference is critical. So what that means is in certain times and places, we collaborate very, very closely with USAID, with DRL, with other entities, but we're also free to pursue a democracy agenda when US government agencies will sometimes have competing agendas or interests. So there is overlap, but there are areas of difference at times. And they're usually ones of sort of tactics and programs, not of broader objectives over a longer period of time. The other piece of it I would note is the structure of the endowment, as I mentioned, brings together the National Democratic Institute, the International Republican Institute, the Solidarity Center, which is an AFL-CIO affiliate, and the Center for International Private Enterprise, which is part of the US Chamber of Commerce. And those four sectors they each receive collectively 50-something% of our money in equal measures. And our board is also reflective of that broad political spectrum of American life. And so it's a self-replicating independent board of directors that pulls from former government officials, former ambassadors, academics, NGO leaders, business leaders, labor leaders, and has broad, deep support across the political spectrum for the ideals and values of democracy. As an institution that doesn't get into policy, we do not work on the United States. We do not fund projects that look to influence or engage the US government in its own policy deliberations. It allows the institution and the board to really look at our work from a different angle and a different perspective, which gives us that independence. So it's programmatic independence. And on the other point I would make on that note is our core collaborating agencies around the world are in equal measure private foundations as they are the bilaterals and groups like DRL. So we work in certain countries much more closely with DRL and AID, and others, our closest collaborators will be the Scandinavians or groups like the Soral Nation and others. So the collaborations really look quite different depending on the nature of the countries where we work. So that's the endowment in a nutshell. We have grown considerably over the last few years, as has DRL. So we are now a $300 million+ a year organization. In my department, which is the program department, we have 100 staff. And one of the unique things about the endowment is we hire country experts and democracy experts, but that's the nature of our staff. We don't hire, our staff are hired to work on the countries. Almost everyone speaks multiple languages in their countries, and that's their area of expertise. It's their professional development. So in a sense, they are democracy promotion professionals. They come, their backgrounds span everything from former government service to Peace Corps to journalists to people who've cut their teeth in the human rights and civil society space. We work out of Washington, D.C. So the nature of the institution is we are a Washington, D.C. based organization, which has its pluses and minuses. One of the great things about it, it gives us the autonomy in the space to pursue aggressive democracy programming, irrespective of the terrain in the countries where we work. So we have large programs in China, Russia, around the world, in places where the endowment and other democracy promotion institutions are not welcome. And the structure of the institution and the nature of our board and our mission is basically provides that independence and that space to pursue those agendas. We also do, as I noted earlier, we fund the core institutes. These are the IRI, NDI, SIPE, and the Solidarity Center. In the early days of the endowment, we were the principal funders of those 4 institutions. As this I don't want to say industry, as this series of institutions has grown around this work, 2 of the 4, the 2-party institutes, now get the majority of their money from other funding sources, including both AID and DRL and foreign governments. They've become international organizations, but they're still part of the core institutes of the endowment. They, in a sense, some of it, at times, there's a lot of overlap between what we fund, and other times they use our monies in very distinct manners from the government funding, which we can get into. The last piece I would note about the endowment is what we have developed over the years is an analytical capacity and a think tank to go along with our core function of grant making. So as by law, we are, there's something called the National Endowment for Democracy Act, which ensures that we are a grant-making organization. So our principal function and 90-something% of our money goes towards our grant programs. We have a small program, small initiatives that look to sort of build on and support the grant-making work. One is the International Forum for Democratic Studies, which publishes the Journal of Democracy. If you haven't read it, I would highly recommend it. It is one of the only publications I've read that's actually accessible to somebody who did not write the article themselves. You can pick it up, you can read widely about the critical issues and themes that are in this work around the world. The authors come from the United States, Western Europe, a lot of research around the world. And we also have smaller initiatives that look at international media assistance and trying to build a greater collaboration among Democrats and democracy support organizations around the world called the World for Democracy. So the one last note, because I know over time, our programming is in some ways similar to AID and DRL when it engages with broad, big American INGOs and contractors and others like that, where we fund the core institutes. But over half of our money and almost 2,000 grants a year go directly to local organizations and not through intermediaries. And so that's why one of the unique factors of the endowment that we don't fund local organizations through intermediaries, but directly from the endowment and managed from Washington, which, as Pat noted, it has its own challenge because we have the same accountability and oversight mechanisms. Note that what I think is really interesting for us is, as a private organization funded by government, we are both accountable to the US government, accountable to the taxpayer, accountable to the tourists, but operate and think and act like a private organization. And that balance and that tension is always there within the institution. We will have a new president for the first time in the endowment's history starting July 26th. So it will be an interesting period ahead. And sorry, one final thing. I think it would be fantastic if Canada got more and more engaged in this. This is a global long-term effort. You see lots of Canadians everywhere engaged in this work. You see, I experience fewer institutions. So if you can turn the Canadian individual engagement into broader institutional, I think it would be welcomed by all of us.
Good. Well, thank you, Brian. And for our audience, Monika and I have been asked to direct a few questions to our panel, and then we're going to do in a relatively brief time, and then we're going to open it up to the audience as a whole, where you use the Q&A function in the Parliamentary Center. will help that part of the program. But let me begin in the time that we have left, Monika and myself, to Brian just ended on the point that he hoped that Canada would make a more vigorous effort around in cooperating with our neighbors and our allies and countries around the world around democratic assistance. And we've heard a very succinct description of the unique American model with an independent entity, NED, but then also very strong democratic drivers within state on policy and within USAID on development. So that itself is a complicated model, but probably a very useful and important one for us to understand. My question is around even to complement it, complicated even further, the broader area of democratic assistance. We have the Nordics involved, the EU involved, Westminster Foundation. We're talking about Canada perhaps getting more involved. I'd be very interested in the panel on your reflections on the community as a whole. Is it informal cooperation around projects? Does it make sense to have a larger strategy? People have talked about a freedom strategy versus an authoritarian strategy and so on. I'd be interested in hearing your views about the nuances of cooperation and whether we need a joint strategy on democratic support in this 21st century. And within that, then, any specific ideas as Canada looks to do more. So perhaps, Brian, perhaps we can start with you because you ended exactly on that point.
Tom, that is a really interesting question. I'm gonna leave it to my government colleagues to talk about sort of a global strategy. But let me take the angle of democracy movements in countries. Mm-hmm. I think there's a huge need for the democratic world. And here I really think it's important to make sure it's not focused, anchored west. We're doing a lot of work trying to bring in the strong, successful Asian democracies in this business, as well as countries in Latin America. So globally, there's absolutely a need, a greater emphasis and more strategic collaboration on a policy and governmental level. I think there's a real risk, though, for a singular voice, overwhelming, I don't know what you called it, overwhelming strategy that, in a sense, would begin to dictate country-specific and organizational priorities for local organizations on the ground. So I think one of the areas where this can be done and has been done well in the past is where there's a lot of information sharing, there's discussion, but the idea that the donor world should coordinate and dictate the strategy for local actors in their own countries becomes problematic. That is not suggesting at a broad policy level, but at the level of where this works is we all need to know what each other is doing so that we don't duplicate efforts, that we learn from each other. But there is a real risk, and I've seen it in action, where donor agencies, in an interest of trying to coordinate, end up controlling. And the second you start controlling the movements themselves or trying to, they lose their motivation, they lose their dynamism, they lose their agency. So I think there's a risk in that as more and more money flows into this area. But at the same time, without question, a broad strategic level, governmental cooperation, policy, multilateral institutions, without question, there's a need for more of that.
Great. Patricia and Rosarie, would you have some comments on this point on cooperation and its nuances and the nature of it? Patricia, you first.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm happy to jump in on follow up on Brian on the policy side. I think that's a very interesting question about, do we need something formal or continue on in informal cooperation? But I do think, I do agree with Brian that you don't want to end up micromanaging at the local level. And I would say I see through our embassies that a lot of that does happen in a good way. I meant in a good way because they're on the ground. And so, if there's a crackdown going on in Burundi or what have you, they do get together and say, what are we going to do in this situation? So I would hate to take that away. But what I would like to see is agreement on some of the core problems that democracy and human rights activists face, and say we need to agree to address these jointly in a big picture fashion. Let me just say, for example, I think there needs to be a stronger united voice pushing back against all of these restrictions on NGOs receiving foreign funding. That is their right under freedom of expression, actually, to receive and impart information as well as funding. We need to firmly do this together and not do it on a country level basis. I'm just going to pick on Pakistan right now. I know that everybody's been working together on Pakistan and pushing back, but it's then the next place it pops up. It needs to be that democracy speak up together and say this is unacceptable. I think the same thing needs to be done when governments stigmatize NGOs as saying they're opposition, they're dissidents, they're foreign agents. Again, I think it needs to be in all of our countries, civil society is a legitimate, credible partner that we need, right? So that we speak up jointly. And the last area I would say is in the issue of reprisals. Now that's one of the things that we do work with Canada on through the Lifeline. And we're working right now through the international financial institutions, but we've seen governments penalizing, going after, attacking activists for supposedly, for speaking up and then calling them traitors and then beating them up or jailing them or worse. We need to be jointly calling that out. I will say that the United Nations does have a body that's supposed to be working on reprisals, but they are very cautious because they want to first examine the issue to find out, was that really an act of reprisal or was it something else going on? Well, we know what starts to happen when you go down that path of there has to be international consensus on this. So I think beyond just money, these groups are looking for us to stand up with them and do it jointly and do it loudly. And I think that does happen, but I think more on a country basis. I think this is something that we could all agree, these things are just not acceptable and we're going to call them out. And we need to do it jointly because it can't be just the United States government, because first of all, that's going to lose some certain types of credibility. And I know some examples where we have worked with Canada, say, taking the lead on this, because you guys have a gravitas and a credibility that we don't always have in certain countries. I'll just be frank on that. So I would like to see that kind of standing up for these kinds of principles. I think this happened a few years back in terms of monitoring of elections, that we kind of pushed the UN to say there are certain standards, domestic and international election monitoring is acceptable, right? And you just put it out there and you don't question it. And every time the government goes down that path, we speak up jointly. That's the only way we can do that. So that's just my kind of thought there. But definitely the more we can have, these kind of principles that we agree we're going to focus on and push back on, but please continue the strong collaboration at a local level as well. I'll stop there.
Thanks. Roz.
Yeah, just to jump in. I mean, I think we do need to come together, because I think the conversation is about this is not business as usual, and this is not just about topping up your funding. I actually do think we need a conversation on how we do this work differently, and what are the tension points within our own countries that are not able to make democracy, rights, and governance central to, let's say, is it our foreign policy making or to our development or to other spaces. So I actually think there is a conversation that needs to be had that talks about what does locally driven, locally demand democracy look like, and what does delivering democracy mean? And so I don't think it's just doing things the way we're doing it now. I actually think we need to have a real conversation with our partners about how we are doing it in this next chapter. And so I think that's the conversation for me is more at that level than at, how much more do we need on media strengthening? I mean, I think that's a piece of it, but I think there's two parts to this conversation that need to happen as we gather together. So it's not just coordinating on programming, but thinking about really what does this next chapter look like for democracy partnerships and democracy. I really don't love using the word assistance or promotion, but what does democracy partnership look like in this next chapter?
Good, thank you. Monika, to you.
The American architecture for democracy engagement, since we don't want to use assistance or promotion, is quite developed. I mean, between the structures within the US government, the role that NED plays, the various institutes, and the much broader civil society and NGO participation in the system, in the partnerships that that the American government funds. But this is also an architecture that has developed over 75 years. Canada's in an interesting moment where we are sort of taking a fresh look and using fresh eyes to kind of perceive and imagine what our engagement and what the architecture in the Canadian system could look like. Looking at successes that you've had over the years, looking at challenges that you've overcome, and also the lessons learned, what advice do you have to Canada that if you were starting from scratch, what would you recommend, or what would your advice be on a future Canadian format and structure for engaging in democracy abroad? Does anyone want to go first? Patricia?
Oh, I was going to say Ro, since Brian went first and I went first. So Ro, if you want to go first.
You first.
I mean, this is a tough one to answer, to be honest, because I think, as you heard in the introduction, we all play unique roles, and we're trying to manage these different tension points, right? The questions of trust and a value, the value of keeping an arm's length from linkages to foreign policy decisions. So, I think it's more than choosing. It's a series of questions that need to be answered first. And that'll drive you towards, what structures follow your objectives. And, I mean, we started to talk about this a little bit before, but, how you manage the tensions between DRG as, inherently political versus technical, right? And I think, we're moving more towards a space of understanding that this is, in fact, a very political space. And it's more about how you navigate that space than about debating whether it's technical versus political. And the last point I would mention, again, these are more issues to discuss rather than solutions, is, the questions related to capacity, which I think both, which everybody has brought up. Working through partners versus working directly with local actors. And again, it's a balancing act of managing risk. But I think, that's part of what I was saying before, this global debate about, what local support or what working with local partners and actors really means, and how do we do that most effectively. I mean, these are the conversations that we're having right now. So let me pass it over to Patricia, and Brian, maybe you could speak more eloquently than I did, but I just know these are live debates, and that's why, it's challenging to provide a very clear answer.
Well, if I may, I do want to jump on, Ro, because I think you laid it out neatly in terms of what is the goal that you're trying to achieve. And I think what AID is doing, this idea of integrating democratic governance across their development sector, is key, right? If you're even trying to make sure that your development sticks, right, you've got to have those good governance structures in there. You've got to have civil society that's able to hold their government accountable to why don't we have clean water, or whatever, why isn't our health system better? So I think that's a place to start, that that doesn't necessarily cost a lot of money. It takes that expertise, it takes that focus. And I think, again, it depends upon what you're trying to achieve. Because if you're looking at, say, crackdowns in a country where you've got to be able to respond, you have to treat it for what it is, which is a political issue, then I think for the safety of your development programs, you need to have an alternative mechanism so that they don't get tainted. Right. So what I'm trying to say is, if you're trying to walk that fine line of, we need to continue to help support, again, health systems in country X, but yet they're cracking down on dissidents and independent journalists, you need to have another mechanism to be able to help support those. That's not going to get you, say, kicked out of a country, for example, right? And so I think that's where in DRL, and Brian can speak to what Ned can do in those cases, but that's where DRL has that ability to do it. I didn't go into that a lot, but we operate in a very discrete fashion, differently than say AID does, in that, for example, all of our programs have branding waivers. So we will be supporting an organization and we don't have the American flag on there because we know that's going to put a big old bullseye on them. For example, we don't, when we do solicitations, when we ask for proposals, applications, in some countries, because it's so sensitive where we work, I think Brian mentions a few of them, Russia, I don't like to say that out loud, but Russia or China or any other countries like that, we don't do a public solicitation. That is, we don't advertise it. We have a group of established NGOs that we know have the ability to operate safely in those countries that have those connections. So we can take that off. It's not going to show up in the newspaper, right? So we can take that off and do it more safely. And it also allows us to be flexible. We can build in flexibility with our grantees to say, look, if the security situation deteriorates, for example, you can no longer work in country, take it offshore, right? So we build that into it. So what I'm saying is what we provide is, I like to think, is a fairly safe, discreet way of saying we have both our development assistance, our goals, we want to make sure that does the right thing. But if we've got these other goals that we need to do without putting a big old bullseye on it, that's what our purpose kind of serves. With that, back to you, Brian.
Thanks. Monika, I'll just put a few things on there, both from my experience working at the NED, but also having had similar conversations with counterparts across Asia for a long time. And let me start by saying I am far from offering guidance, suggestions, or telling the Canadians what to do. So please take it in that vein. One, the first, and I think this is really important, is the institutional structure has to be politically durable. There's no perfect model for it, but if it's not politically durable, it then loses its either independence, or even if it's inside the government, its mission and its mandate and its focus can be driven in directions that are counter to its original purpose. So that is important. In the case of the endowment, which I don't think would be the model in any other country, having Republicans, Democrats, and labor and business around the table in equal measures with an equal voice at the table gives us that durability and independence. The second thing is a number of organizations that have been engaged in this work over the years, private foundations, government funded ones, they mix domestic and international work. And there are ways to do it, but there are also plenty of models where working on your own country introduces politics into the work that can and has in certain places interfered with the pursuit of that mission abroad. I don't know what that would look like in Canada, but that mixing of domestic and international work can be complicating. The endowment is forbidden from working on the United States. Mm-hmm. So people ask us why we don't work on the United States. We don't have to hem and haw about why we don't. We simply are not allowed to, so we don't engage in that. The next thing, and I think this is perhaps the most important, is risk tolerance. Mm-hmm. And that can be political risk, it can be financial risk, it can be programmatic risk. But ensuring that those who are backing it, those who are funding it, understand the risk tolerance you want to take. And I think that calculation is different for every country around the world. So if you're New Zealand or Australia and you're doing this work in Asia, there's a different risk calculation in provoking certain neighbors than there might be for the United States to fund the same type of program. Mm-hmm. So I would put that in that category. And the last thing I would say is, and I really don't mean this in a critical way, that I think the democracy world has grown where you now have tremendous expertise in this field. And that hiring experts and treating it like a profession, much like you would other sectors, is absolutely critical. Mm. Theories of change, political systems, types of programming. There's a wealth of expertise that exists in the world that work in the space of politics, democratization, and recognizing that over the last 30 years, that body of knowledge has developed, and it's critical to have it built into the systems or the institutions that you create.
Good. Well, thank you, Brian. And each of our panelists have raised a host of issues that we could well spend another hour on and going back and forth. But I'm conscious of time and the fact that we also have a long list of folks who have tuned into the webinar who also want to have their question raised. So I think I want to thank the panelists for their response to the question of by myself and Monika, and turn it back over to the Parliamentary Center, and just end on this note, Brian, because you talked about it, the importance of being politically durable. That in Canada, we've had 2 parliamentary committees from all parties suggest a heightened democratic mission with differing institutions. And that also is interesting in that this has been parliamentary driven. Now the executive has responded, but a conservative government and a liberal government, not yet to create one, but MPs from all parties have been interested in this work since, naturally enough, they are elected. They believe in democracy. They've put their careers and their families and so on in this pursuit in Canada. So a politically durable institution is a very important message, I think, that we've had from all of our panelists. So Gabrielle, back to you, and thanks to the panel for being so easy to moderate.
Thank you. Thank you all. This has been such an interesting conversation. We're really keen with all of the feedback you've provided and the questions that have come in as well, which are quite numerous. So we're going to get started. I'll just remind you, please do add your questions to the Q&A section of the Zoom function. You're also able to upvote questions. So if there's something that is interesting to you, no worries about repeating the same question, just vote for it and it'll add up the list. We're not going to go in the exact order that we've got on the Q&A here because there are several that touch on the same topics, and I've been trying to group them together a bit as we go along. But I would like to get started with a question from Catherine Godin. She addresses the question to Brian. I think it is something that's relevant for all. But she writes, Brian, you have indicated that the endowment does not work in the US, and explained why in our last question. But in the current context, it's widely recognized that the links between domestic and international are impactful. How can you reconcile this new requirement in the work that you do? Thank you.
I absolutely agree with you. The strength, democracies have succeeded and excelled and framed the debate around the world. There are no countries, including China for that matter, that don't claim in some way, they use the word democratic. They talk about their systems as if they were democratic. There are very, very few countries on the face of the earth that have sort of wave a flag of we are proudly anti-democratic, we are proudly authoritarian or autocratic. So my point is that the ideas that animate democracies still are basically the argument that you have to knock down to succeed. So the US, like every other country, the stronger we are domestically, the more we can demonstrate and lead, the more powerful we are as a country and the more influential. But for us, I think you can recognize that and you can understand dealing with problems at home is instrumental to the strength of the United States in its ability to deal with problems abroad. Whether it's addressing problems, leading through example, facilitating other countries' development. But for us, my answer to always that is the United States has more than an adequate investment from our own philanthropic communities, NGOs, private citizens, government entities at all levels that are engaged in strengthening democratic development at home. So for me, when I answer the question for the NED, the fact that we don't work on the United States is not a reflection that the United States does not have considerable work to do on its own democratic system, structures, ideas, values, but that there are other entities better placed than we are to tackle those challenges. But I agree with the fundamental precept that you can't do this work. This work is less effective, less impactful, and has less leadership when the countries leading it aren't setting an example that the rest of the world wants to follow.
Thanks so much. Do any of the others have anything to add on that?
This is Pat. I'll just quickly add that President Biden has made it very clear that he does want to see these connections between the domestic and the international. And has, sorry, that's my cat, has tasked us. I have a new rescue kitty, sorry. He's tasked us with making that explicit connection. So we are, I don't want to say grappling with it, but I think we're trying to make it more apparent. And I will say that, for example, in our work, I know AIDs, and NEDs, nowhere do we show up and say, we're America, we have the answers and do it our way, right? That is not what we do. So in this world, we try to help governments who've made their own commitments to democracy and human rights to help civil society demand that accountability, that responsiveness from their governments. And in many of those cases, we do, for example, bring groups from the United States to talk about how we do it here, not as here's a model, but let me just give you an example. We have a program that tries to counter, has been for years countering hate speech against religious groups. And so we have a program where we work with civil society and government officials in certain countries to say, how do you handle this, not to shut down that speech, but how do you work together to address that? And what we do is we bring, if it's a Muslim country, for example, we bring Muslim organization, US Muslim groups together with somebody from our Department of Justice Civil Rights Division and do that. And so we've kind of started those conversations here in the US of linking what we do there with here, of saying it needs, maybe not a continuum, but there definitely needs, it needs to be say it all works together. And so I think this is going forward going to be an interesting one. We've already started in terms of racial equity. We've worked with a group that does work overseas. They're based in the United States, but we've already started a project with how they're dealing with racial equity in the United States and how we do it abroad. I think this is going to be very interesting. But I will note, just like Brian, we cannot use our foreign assistance funding inside the United States, but we can make those connections, we can facilitate it, we can be. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ro, do you have anything to add?
Just quickly, I mean, I think it's a question of messaging and the language we use and a shift in how we approach our work. That's why you already heard me say democracy partnerships. So I think, you know, there's that piece to it. And then as Pat was saying, you know, the exploration of what does that actually mean for our programs. And I think we're all trying to figure that piece out together where, you know, the exchange route and bringing in, you know, opportunities for shared experiences or peer-to-peer learning, you know, that seems to be a safer space to move in that direction and to begin to create these linkages. But as I think Pat noted, that's what we're exploring right now as we speak. And so we've got some ideas on messaging and exchanges, but much more to go to better understand what that means for us. But I think we're all on the same page that linkage has to be made. It's just what will get us to where we need to be, you know, for supporting democracies globally. So.
Thank you so much. I'll remind our attendees also that our Canadian guests are now a part of the panel, so they'll be able to receive your questions as well. Sorry for the ringing. I would like to put another question to the group. We've received several questions on the same topic, one from Devin O'Shaughnessy from the WFD and another from Gerard Schmitz, a long-term supporter of this topic in Canada. And it's the question of the famous Summit of Democracies, which we have heard about. Just in general, what can you tell us about the upcoming Global Democracy Summit, maybe to introduce it for those that are not familiar with it? And is the issue of democracy support something that might come up in that space? Is it perhaps an opportunity to spur stronger action by Canada? Thank you.
I guess I'll take that one on because Darrell is leading that effort within the State Department of coordinating with the National Security Council on that. And let me just preface this by saying I can't get ahead of the planning on this, which is still underway. But I can tell you there's two things that they are expecting out of this summit, which is that governments, first it'll be both governments and civil society participating again to say we can't have this be a government solution alone. But it's also going to be that they're going to, there's three pillars, one of which is better protecting human rights activists and defenders. Anti-corruption is another pillar of that. And then sorry, that what they want to see happen is that governments come committed to the summit to say, what are they going to commit to promote and protect human rights or counter corruption at home, what they might want to do internationally, and how we can do this together. So I think they are looking specifically for those three things. And I think that is something that we would always, of course, welcome having a discussion with Canada on that, but it is very much going to be, that is where you're going to see that strongest link between international and domestic. So I can't even, I don't even want to speculate what the United States is going to commit to domestically, but I do know that that is the marching orders, or what that will be coming out of that, if that's helpful enough. But they're very much wanting this to be something that governments will be making a commitment. What can we be doing to promote democracy abroad, or not just promote it, but how can we halt the backsliding, the democratic backsliding? How can we counter authoritarianism?
And I can just add one quick point. I mean, I think you kind of answered it in your question. You know, the summit's an opportunity to galvanize collective action, right? To confront the immense challenge in front of us. So, you know, an action enforcing event to get people to up their game, including the U.S., right? And I can tell you, it's definitely working in terms of U.S. galvanizing around what it needs to do, and it's at home, and what it's willing to commit to abroad. So, you know, what we've been saying is, the summit itself, you know, the actual date or the moment or the location is less important than what it allows us to achieve globally in future years. So as we think about this as, you know, a moment to come together, you know, double down, commit, and lay that out for the years to come. I mean, that's I think the broader goal of what we're trying to achieve.
Thank you. And I'd also like to ask Tom Axworthy, if you would also step in on this from the Canadian point of view. How do you think Canada could best prepare to prepare for this moment of engagement and renewed commitment to democracy?
Well, what Canada should do, what the executive should do, is create the new democratic institution that Parliament has been calling for 15 years. I mean, there's been a very clear parliamentary consensus that, for all the reasons that some of the panel have talked about now, that you need a standalone institution that continues to work on democracy in all seasons, with all parties. You need an institution that takes up the energy of members of Parliament from all parties. We need to compare best practices from around the world, and a standalone institution has, with its own programming, has a flexibility that diplomats in the field often can't have. So for all those reasons, for many years now, parliamentarians have been arguing that we need to add a new piece to our architecture. And then that new piece has got to have visible and active programming in a variety of areas. But I would think for the summit that a necessary first step would be to create more robust institutions in Canada that Parliament has called for, which itself is democratic accountability. Not a bad way to start.
Thank you so much for that. All right, we are getting close on time now, and we were not going to have time to address all of the outstanding questions that we've received, but I would like to cover as many as possible. Just to let you know where we're at, we've received several questions about specific country programs and activities. I'm not going to ask those to the panelists at this point in time because we have talked about China a bit, and this is an opportunity to talk more about institutional arrangements and architecture, but I do appreciate those questions very much that we have received. We have a question from Owen Lippert, which is for Ned, so I'll put it there. He asks, as a fan of Ned, will it be starting to look at mentoring international high-quality democracy promotion agencies based in the developing world, perhaps one that Canada might be a co-incubator of. So could I ask Brian for a brief response on this interesting idea of democracy promotion agencies based abroad?
And it's actually, yes, we are. I would limit it to the countries we are engaging with, and we're farther ahead in this effort in Asia than other countries, and it's countries like Korea, Taiwan, Japan, Indonesia, Australia, India. There are other countries around the world, but I think that if I understand the gist of your question, the strength of this work over time will only succeed if it's truly global. So my feeling is, as important to get Canada involved, the broader the community of democracies who engage in this work from their own vantage point, the better. There are some countries that we've worked with that have an interest in the work, but they don't have any missionary zeal to it, or they have an approach that really looks at it from a technocratic or institution to institution collaboration in countries where they are in essence invited in. But yes, in a nutshell, we are working on that. We are engaged in it. I think having the Canadians and others involved in trying to not stand up, but support the development of democracy promotion organizations in countries around the world is absolutely essential.
Thanks.
Can I just very quickly note that with our Lifeline program, we have, I believe, 21 other governments who are partners in that. And what has been interesting is we have partners that don't traditionally even do foreign assistance programs. And so this kind of a partnership provided a way for them to give money. What happens is people give money to the State Department and we manage it through a grant. But we've got partners in there that love this opportunity to be able to be engaged in democracy assistance because they just don't have the institutions to do so. And the flip side, I would say, also is we're striving to help build up and strengthen regional organizations that are engaged in specific areas that can then do subgranting themselves, right? So for example, in the LGBTI world, there are institutions that are very good and they have the local partners and they work with them. We're helping build up their capacity to take money and subgrant it out themselves. So it's sort of what Brian is saying. You need to get directly to the grassroots without the intermediary, where we're trying to go even further to say, you guys know best what needs to be supported. So let's help build up your capacity to do that. And they do these peer-to-peer grants. It's their own decision-making. It's like NED, they have their own board. I think more of those kinds of things would also be helpful. Again, you have to grow them slowly because it's still taxpayer money.
Thanks so much. All right. We have a question from Jessica Hurdle about some institutional arrangements. So the parliamentary report that came out 2 years ago had 3 axes for Canada to re-engage: one within its own civil service, second within an independent body to be created, and third with existing civil society partners. Jessica's question is related to that. She writes, what is the relationship between policy and programming within your activities? And how do you coordinate with NGOs? And also, how does research fit into this question? Do you recommend that there should be an in-house research capacity within your partners, or do you prefer to work with research institutions or universities or otherwise? Thank you.
I'm
happy to go first on that. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll go ahead. I'm never shy, but Brian, if you want to jump in first, that's fine too. Okay. Sorry. It's hard on Zoom. Let me just start with the last on the research, because Ned is the leader on that, I would argue, with your democracy studies, and then what Ro talked about, that they do a lot of research too. I'm always a firm believer in pluralism, right? That you can't just say, oh, look, there's the one institution and they should do it all. I know there's coordination. DRL does some of its own work through our evaluation, but we also coordinate, right? So we can share things. And again, you're able to come out this, but I do think it's important just for the learning purpose alone to have a research, but you can also work with universities. So that's what we do. Probably the most, where we have our evaluation team works with universities to do these kind of not evaluations, to do these kind of capstone projects where we give them the data and they crunch it for us, so to speak. So I would, there's like different models, hybrid models of how you can do that. And now I've forgotten what the first part of the question was, though. The policy part, was that it?
The relationship between policy and programming.
Right. And that's where I would say, Dira, we're the most fine-tuned there, where, again, as the lead agency for democracy and human rights in the State Department, we're the ones that people come to and say, okay, we got a problem, fix it. So that's what we do. We're also, as I said, very strong bipartisan support, Tom. I would say you guys need to talk to our congressmen. They made this happen here. If the executive branch wasn't doing it, they just made the money available and forced us to do it. So, but I do think, again, it depends upon what your objective is. But if you want to do that link, I think this is the place to do it. You can't really outsource that, if you will, right? Again, I think Brian is right. Independent institutions are needed, but then there's going to be some cases where you got to have that firm link with diplomacy or it's not going to work, right? So we might program money to help build up watchdog organizations in a certain country. They come up with a report that says this government isn't doing X, Y, Z. We've got our diplomats going in and saying, why aren't you guys doing X, Y, and Z? So I think that that is an important piece of this puzzle. Over.
If it's okay, I'll just jump in on this question too. I mean, it speaks to, the virtuous learning cycle that I mentioned and why I went through, the 7 functions of the center: training, practice, learning, adapting, research, policy. You can't really just do one of them, right? You need that cycle, and you need to have capabilities in all of those elements to make it work. Now, that doesn't mean we have to do all the research, but we definitely need a unit that is, let's say, for example, translating that research to our folks on the ground, because you can't give them a journal article to read. You can't even give them a 60-page report to read. They said, distill it. What does this mean for our programming, in 3 to 4 pages? That's what we want. And so you need to have that function that is doing that. And you need to have that connection with the field too, that's telling you what the hard questions are. This is what we cannot figure out. Can you help our research institutions to gear research towards these questions? That's why our learning agenda is developed with our field colleagues to understand what are the challenges that they're having on the ground. The last thing I would say on the policy piece, it's also why you've seen USAID take a much more elevated role at the National Security Council and in policy, because these concepts of divorcing these issues, programming from policy, I mean, this is what I mean about creating sometimes these artificial constructs when that's not how, it happens on the ground, or that's not what happens in reality. So, policy must be informed by the $22 billion in programming that USAID is doing each year. And so how we connect this cycle in a much more fluid way, I think tries to get at the heart of, how are we going to do this in a much more coordinated, strategic, and effective way. And I think we're moving in that direction, with some of these puzzle pieces and fitting them together.
Let me just add very briefly. I don't have anything to policy and programming. I think Ro and Pat covered that really well. On research, it is clearly a critical area that needs to be explored. And I would say that I don't think the answer is in-house or out of house. It's making sure that the institutions understand what questions they need to ask and what kind of information they need. As I said earlier, when I started, we never hired anyone who had a degree in democratization studies. Now you can hire them all over the place. Every university teaches this. There's a body of evidence, a body of literature. It's global in nature. So there's just a wealth of research out there. And I don't think there's a magic to the in-house, out-of-house. The endowment one has worked because the 2 people running it, Larry Diamond and Mark Plattner, have really just been leaders in the field and have attracted the best writing. And so there's something to be said for doing it well and investing in it, so you produce a quality product. But I don't know if there's a magic to being in-house or out-of-house. We gave them the independence and the funding to do it well and do it properly. I would just say on coordination, one little point is, I think sometimes my feeling over the years with this is that coordination with NGOs should be understood as it would with any other type of institutions where there's room for cooperation on shared policy objectives or programmatic needs, but there's also inherent competition among NGOs. And we should be careful of sort of forcing cooperation and coordination to a degree that actually works against local organizations' interests. So it's a very, very fine balance. And I think when you put money behind coordination and cooperation, it sometimes has the effect that you don't want, which is beginning to take away, and I said this in the beginning, local ownership of their own agendas. So I think to get the coordination right, and it's an example between USAID, DRL, and NED, we should be coordinating as much as we can, sharing information, talking about strategy, but ensuring that we don't impose a singular vision on local organizations and actors. It's a fine line to walk, I get it, but I just think sometimes we err on thinking that NGOs that work well together always are inherently cooperative and collaborative, and I've never seen it in my life. Never. They compete on strategy, programs, money, influence, and sometimes they're on the same page, but they aren't always, and that's the nature of it, and we should protect that really diligently.
At 1,000 ideas, Blue.
Yeah. All right. So I just would like to put this question also to Monika before we wrap up. We've talked about this relationship, but what do you think about how the role of the field, of actors in the field and partners who are on the ground, what is their role in informing program design and policy priorities? Monika?
I would just make the point, while much of the conversation that just happened was about how the policy discussion engages in programming, I think as anyone who's worked in the field and any practitioner would know, is that how much for a successful program, it really has to be designed and informed by the partners on the ground, which becomes a complicated discussion when you're looking at global strategies to support democracy and on democracy engagement, because the most successful country initiative in a particular country at a particular moment is going to be reflective of how that community and how those partnerships and how those institutions want to engage. I mean, to some extent, when we're talking about democracy and human rights and the rule of law, we are talking about values, and we are talking about strengthening and affecting global values. And that's very much making sure that the policy process is both top down but bottom up at the same time.
All right. Thank you so much. We are so close to the end. I wanted to offer the opportunity for each of our speakers, American and Canadian, to just say in one or two sentences max, any parting words of advice that you would like to offer in terms of the architecture of democracy assistance for Canada as it moves forward in this course. If you don't mind, I'll go straight across my screen as I see it. Could we start with Patricia Davis?
Thank you. Again, thank you for this opportunity. I think I just want to reiterate what we've already heard, in particular what you just said, Monika. It needs to be both a top down, because these are our values, but a bottom up. And I think for us, the way we do this is we will identify what the problem is. Here's what we're trying to, the objective we have, the goal we have. You come to us with your creative ideas. We don't design, we don't say bid on this contract, so to speak, who can do this the cheapest. It's give us your creative ideas. And I think that gets at what everybody's saying. It can't be, it has to be locally owned. We have to be empowering people on the ground. It can't be an international intervention from afar. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Monika.
I think, I mean, having been a part of this conversation in Canada, both working for Canadian civil society, but also working in government and helping design what a formula for Canadian engagement and democracy abroad would look like. I think part of the challenge is we keep thinking and we keep talking, and to some point we just need to take it, we just need to start doing it. We need to take that first or second step forward. Because to some extent, this is a field that has changed, it has transformed in the last 25 years. It has transformed again in the last 5 years. And even now with the role that technology is playing, the nature of engagement is changing at such a rapid pace that everything is going to be a bit of a step forward, learning process, challenges and opportunities. And the important move is just, the important thing is just to start and get into the game. So that I want to thank the panelists, and I do appreciate, and just want to highlight one other comment, that there was a bit of a conversation earlier about the risks that are involved with this type of work. And there's a truth for that whenever you're working in fragile or transitional environments. But these are all risks that are calculated and addressed in the time that's been doing. And democracy work has been happening around the world in some of the in environments where Western governments are welcomed in as partners, and in other environments where we're working with the citizens directly. And in that scenario, these are just taking the first step, and getting involved in the practice is probably the most important thing we can do.
Thanks so much. Brian.
I would say it's worth starting, like having a really solid foundation, but I would encourage you guys to push for a significant enough budget that you are a big player, that you should be relatively quickly. The adversaries to what we're all interested in, democracy and human rights, are spending billions and billions of dollars. There's an estimate that China alone spends over $15 billion a year on this, whether or not that's actually the totality. So the democratic world needs to really put its money where its mouth is, and have strong institutions that are financially viable to really make a difference.
Thank you so much. Ro.
Yep, that's a good segue, actually, Brian, because, you know, this isn't all hands on deck, and it's not an either or. You know, the independent institution plays its role. Pat, I hope you'll agree with me that, you know, putting democracy, rights, and governance central to our foreign policy is a critical step that we have to make. You know, not competing with other priorities, but in tandem, in support of stability and security and others. And the same goes for the development space. I mean, Pat, you mentioned development outcomes. You know, development outcomes that are not equitable and inclusive only help to erode democracy and move us in the opposite direction. So I think we've got some hard questions to ask ourselves, you know, in the US government of where we're putting this. And I would challenge you all to ask the same questions, because it's not one or the other. It's how are we putting these things front and center in each of the different spaces that we work. So, you know, that would be that's how we're working through it, and would challenge you all to do the same.
Thank you so much. And I understand if you need to drop off the call because it is that time, but a last word from Tom Axworthy before we end with Tom Cormier in Ottawa. Thank you.
Well, I would just say, Gabrielle, with everyone's experience on the panel in talking what more Canada should do, would be really the importance of the field as a whole. Let me just quickly tell you a story. I was in Ukraine on a mission, and with President Reagan died, and several of the militants and the activists there put their own money together to go to the funeral, and I was very interested in that because they didn't have much. And it was because when they were fighting the good fight for human rights and so on, they remembered his speech about tear down that wall. Now, when they felt alone and harassed and threatened, they knew that others cared. And so we have to be careful about not imposing a so-called Western mission. And we've had lots of that discussion intelligently today. But let's never forget how hard it is to fight for democracy and human rights where it is not there. And therefore, all of us have to do more, including my own country, to make sure future generations of democratic activists also know they're not alone.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of the panelists. This has been wonderful. Tom Cormier, over to you.
Thank you. Let me thank each and every one of you for the thoughtful preparation, the discussions, the question and answers. Just summing up, because it's all been said, but look, I think this is complicated, but it's essential. It's about foreign policy and its linkage to development outcomes. This work is essential. This work takes on new meaning because others are working against it more consistently and in ways that we should be worried about. But also, I really like this notion of partnership. It's something we talk about a lot because this is a partnership, and it's a partnership of democracies that are longstanding, but also those countries that where things have taken hold. Some of them are mentioned: Indonesia, Korea, Japan, places that have really made strong transitions, bringing them into the discussion more as partners. Research backing up what we do in partnership with local stakeholders. These are about accompaniments and helping people with a cafeteria of ideas where they make their own decisions based on some experiences, benchmarks, standards, whatever we want to call them, inspiring them to make good choices. The Democracy Summit, clearly an opportunity. We've got our sights on, and you'll hear more from us on that. And also in Canada, it's clear there's a consensus, a multi-party consensus. This is the right thing that we should be doing more of. So it's time to act. Stay tuned. Thank you very much.
Thank you all so much again. Thank you to the Embassy in Ottawa for supporting this initiative. We look forward to seeing all of you in attendance at our next event in a few weeks' time on the topic of parliamentary support. Thank you so much. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.